Hey guys, tonight we begin with something comforting. And by comforting, I mean deeply uncomfortable. So go ahead and dim the lights. Maybe adjust your pillow and let your shoulders sink a little. We are not storming castles tonight. We are not charging into battle. We are simply existing in the Middle Ages, which, as it turns out, was already a full-time endurance sport. This is the story of what pain people considered completely normal in medieval daily life. The aches, the stings, the slow-burning discomforts that nobody questioned, because if everyone hurts, then technically no one is suffering. Right, so settle in. Let's drift gently into a world where pain was just part of the background noise, like church bells or a rooster who also hasn't slept well. Now, the first thing to understand is that medieval people did not expect to feel good. That was not the baseline. Today, if your back twinges slightly, you Google it. In 1320, if your back hurt, that was simply because you had a back. Most people worked physically demanding jobs from childhood. Farmers bent over fields from sunrise to sunset. Blacksmiths lifted, hammered, and inhaled smoke all day. Even noble women, draped in velvet and technical superiority, were laced into stiff bodices and expected to produce airs like a slightly exhausted assembly line. Chronic pain was not a diagnosis. It was adulthood. Arthritis in your 30s? Of course, rotten teeth by 25. Naturally, knees that sounded like a gravel path. Welcome to being alive. Let's start with dental pain, because honestly, it deserves its own slow, sympathetic nod. Medieval diets were heavy on coarse bread, and that bread was often filled with tiny bits of stone from the grinding process. So every meal was basically bread with a hint of gravel. Over time, this wore teeth down dramatically. Adine, seriflurid, limited hygiene, and a fondness for sweets among the wealthy, and you have a kingdom of aching molars. Toothaches were constant companions. The solution? Sometimes clove oil, sometimes prayer, and sometimes a barber surgeon who would simply pull the tooth out with metal tools that looked like they were also used on horses. No anesthesia, just vibes. And everyone agreed this was unpleasant, but normal. Headaches were another quiet constant. Medieval homes were smoky, fireplaces had poor ventilation, and most cooking happened indoors over open flames. Imagine living in a permanent mild chimney. Your eyes sting. Your lungs burn a little. You probably have a headache. But that's just Tuesday. Add dehydration, because clean water was not always guaranteed, and you have a population walking around slightly dizzy most of the time. No one labeled it. No one took a day off. You simply rubbed your temples and continued churning butter. And then there were stomach pains. Oh, the stomach pains. Food preservation was experimental. Meat was salted heavily to prevent rot. Vegetables were seasonal, sometimes grain spoiled, and grew ergot fungus, which could cause hallucinations and convulsions. Casual. Parasites were extremely common. Worms were just part of the ecosystem of your body. You might feel bloated, cramped, vaguely unwell, but unless you were dramatically collapsing, it was considered manageable. The medieval mindset was less "I don't feel great" and more "well, I'm not dead, so we proceed." Now let's gently wander into the world of childbirth, which medieval society treated as both miraculous and alarmingly routine. For women, pain was woven directly into religious teaching. It was framed as natural, even divinely ordained. Labor without modern medicine was long, dangerous, and intensely painful. And yet it was expected. Women were surrounded by other women, midwives offering guidance, herbal mixtures attempting to help. But the baseline assumption was simple: T's will hurt deeply. And that was normal. Survival was celebrated. The pain itself was not questioned. It was absorbed into daily life. Like another chore, even clothing caused discomfort. Wool, the most common fabric, could be itchy and heavy. Undergarments were basic. Shoes were often stiff and poorly fitted. Imagine walking miles on uneven roads in hard leather soles with no cushioning. Blisters were standard. Cold feet in winter were unavoidable. Frostbite was not rare in harsher climates. But you did not complain that your boots lacked arch support. You simply adjusted your stride and kept moving. Comfort was a luxury concept, not an expectation. Let's float over to the aristocracy for a moment, because surely their lives were softer. Well, slightly, but not by much. Nobles avoided field labor, yes. However, they faced their own suite of normalized suffering. Heavy ceremonial clothing weighed several pounds. Corsetry compressed ribs and organs. Royal children were often swaddled tightly for long periods, because people believed it helped limbs grow straight. Medical treatments for the elite included bloodletting, purging, and herbal concoctions that were enthusiastic, if not effective. If a king felt unwell, physicians might decide he had too much blood, so they removed some. Because why not double down? Skin conditions were also widespread. Bathing practices varied by time and region, but regular hot baths were not always accessible. Lice and fleas were extremely common, even in castles. Yes, castles. Royal bedding was not immune. People scratched constantly. It was simply part of being human. Imagine attending court while subtly itching your scalp under an elaborate headdress. No one would judge you. They were doing it too. And perhaps one of the most pervasive forms of pain was simply exhaustion. Sleep conditions were basic. Beds were often shared. Privacy was rare. Workdays followed the sun. In agricultural seasons, labor was relentless. Bodies were rarely fully rested. Muscles remained sore. Joints stiffened overnight and protested again in the morning. But this rhythm was accepted. Life was physical. Life was uncomfortable. And strangely, within that discomfort, there was a shared understanding. No one expected ease. They expected endurance. So as you lie there tonight, in a temperature-controlled room, on a mattress engineered by science and capitalism, just notice how different your baseline is. A small headache feels like an inconvenience. A dentist appointment is routine. Warm socks are standard. Medieval people would consider you extravagantly delicate. And honestly, they would not be wrong. But that's the beauty of history. It reminds us that comfort is not universal. It is constructed, earned slowly over centuries of aching backs and stubborn toothaches. Let's begin with farmers, the backbone of medieval society, and the unofficial champions of lower back pain. Farming before modern machinery was a slow, repetitive, muscle-grinding process. Plowing required guiding heavy wooden plows through stubborn soil, often behind oxen who were not emotionally invested in your spinal health. Harvesting meant bending. 4 hours, sometimes days. Wheat does not politely rise to meet you, it stays down, so farmers stayed down with it. Knees in the dirt, spine curved like a question mark. By the time many peasants reached their 30s, their bodies already felt experienced. No one called it chronic strain. It was just called Tuesday. And then there were millers. Now, millers worked with large grinding stones that turned grain into flour. Helpful, yes, but those grinding stones produced fine dust. Clouds of it, the kind that settled into lungs and stayed there. Breathing became a slightly scratchy experience over time. Persistent coughs were common. Eyes irritated. Skin dry. But the village needed flour, so the miller coughed politely into his sleeve and continued rotating heavy stones like a slightly wheezing superhero. Blacksmiths, meanwhile, lived in a permanent sauna of sparks and smoke. Imagine standing inches from a roaring fire for most of your life. A Marinon muscles tense, repeating the same motion over and over again. The ringing in their ears must have been impressive. Metal striking metal all day long. No ear protection. Just commitment. Burns were routine. Small ones mostly. Sometimes larger ones. Hands grew thick with calluses. Arms strong but stiff. Shoulders permanently tight. If a blacksmith woke up without something aching, he probably assumed something was wrong. Now let's drift into a quieter profession. The scribes, monks, and clerks who copied manuscripts by hand for hours in cold stone rooms. Sounds peaceful, right? Candlelight, silence, ink flowing gently across parchment. Except they were hunched. Constantly. Heads tilted down. Fingers gripping quills tightly. Over time, many scribes developed what we would now recognize as repetitive strain injuries. Hand cramps, swollen joints, aching wrists. Some manuscripts even contain little side notes where scribes complain softly about their pain. One famously wrote something along the lines of, "Writing is excessive drudgery. It crooks your back, dims your sight, and twists your stomach." Which feels like the medieval version of leaving a one-star job review. And speaking of dimmed sight, let's talk about vision. Candlelight and oil lamps were the primary sources of illumination. Indoors. Dim, flickering. Uneven. Reading or sewing by that light required intense focus. Eyes strained constantly. Glasses did exist by the late Middle Ages, but they were rare and expensive. So most people simply squinted through life. Blurry vision in old age was not corrected. It was accepted. You just held things farther away and hoped for the best. Now, butchers. They had perhaps one of the most quietly brutal routines. Slaughtering animals by hand, lifting carcasses, standing on wet stone floors for long periods. The smell alone must have been immersive, but physically, the job required strength and endurance. Cuts were common. Small infections followed. Nothing dramatic, just the steady accumulation of tiny injuries. Again, no antibiotics, just herbal salves and optimism. Let's gently wander into construction work. Masons, carpenters, builders of those grand cathedrals we admire today. The men who lifted stone blocks weighing more than your average dining table. Scaffolding was wooden and occasionally adventurous. Falls did happen, yes, but even without dramatic accidents, the daily strain was intense. Hauling stone, climbing repeatedly, hands cracked from lime mortar. Lime, by the way, could burn skin, so imagine working with something mildly corrosive every day. Your skid adjusts, or at least it tries to. Fishermen had their own version of quiet suffering. Cold water, damp clothes, early mornings, nets heavy with catch or not heavy at all, which brought a different kind of stress. Saltwater cracked skin over time, fingers numbed in winter, but fish were needed. So into the water they went, again and again. Now let's float briefly to domestic servants in noble households. Their work was indoors, yes, but hardly gentle. Hauling water up staircases, carrying firewood, scrubbing floors by hand. Kneeling for long periods while cleaning, laundry alone was a full-body workout. Water drawn from wells, heated manually, fabric scrubbed against rough boards, wrung out by twisting arms that were already tired. Hands chapped raw in winter, but complaining was not in the job description. Even children were not spared from the slow grind of labor. Medieval childhood, especially among peasants, involved helping early, tending animals, carrying tools, gathering firewood. Their bodies adapted. Yes, but adaptation doesn't mean absence of pain. It just means you grow up, assuming it's normal. And here's the subtle theme running through all of this. Pain was expected. It was not individualized. If everyone around you also had sore hands, aching knees, and tired eyes, then that was simply the human condition. There was no cultural script encouraging you to optimize comfort. Comfort was not optimized. Survival was. Even leisure activities weren't entirely gentle. Hunting required long rides and tense focus. Archery demanded repetitive pulling of heavy bows, which over time actually altered bone structure in skilled archers. Skeletons of medieval longbowmen show asymmetry in their arms and shoulders from years of drawing powerful bows. Imagine your hobby literally reshaping you. Subtly, quietly. And so, as we drift through this landscape of steady discomfort, it becomes clear that medieval pain was rarely explosive. It was cumulative, layered. A dull symphony of aches playing softly in the background of daily life. People adjusted, bodies adapted as much as they could. And when they couldn't, well, you simply slowed down a little earlier in life. Tonight, as you lie comfortably still, just notice how foreign that baseline feels. Your mattress supports your spine. Your lighting is stable and bright. Your shoes likely have cushioning. The medieval farmer would look at your life and assume you were royalty. Possibly suspicious royalty, because no one lives that comfortably without some kind of secret. Now, medieval medicine was built on a very confident theory called the four humors. According to this idea, your body contained four fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. And if you were feeling unwell, clearly one of those was out of balance. Too much blood, problem. Too much black bile, also problem. The solution was not subtle. The solution was to remove something. Usually blood, because when in doubt, drain it out. Bloodletting was astonishingly common. Physicians believed it could treat fevers, headaches, infections, even emotional distress. Feeling a little melancholic, perhaps your black bile is dramatic. Let's remove some blood. And they did, using knives or lancets. Sometimes cupping, sometimes leeches, which were essentially tiny, wriggling interns with excellent suction skills. And to be fair, leeches were not entirely useless. In some modern medical situations, they're still used, but medieval doctors were not always selective. If you had a pulse, you were a candidate. And imagine the calm acceptance of this. You'll feel dizzy and weak. The doctor says, "Ah, yes, too much blood." And instead of questioning the logic, you roll up your sleeve. Because this is science. Medieval science, which is science with confidence, but not always evidence. Herbal remedies were also extremely popular. Some were genuinely helpful. Willow bark, for example, contains salicylic acid, which is related to aspirin. So occasionally, they stumbled onto something effective. But other treatments involve mixtures that sounded like kitchen experiments gone rogue. Crushed herbs mixed with wine. Animal fats blended with mysterious roots. Powders made from dried insects. It was less pharmacy and more enchanted pantry. Let's gently glide into surgery. Now, surgery existed, but anesthesia did not. At least, not in any reliable form. There were herbal sedatives. Alcohol was encouraged. Sometimes, patients were simply held down by strong friends. Procedures were quick. Efficiency was survival. Removing an arrowhead, draining an abscess, amputating a limb. Swift movements, minimal hesitation, because the longer it took, the worse it got. Infections were a constant risk. Germ theory was centuries away. Instruments were not sterilized in the modern sense. Hands were washed occasionally, but not because of microscopic organisms. More because visible dirt was visible. So post-surgical pain often blended into infection pain. Fever followed, swelling followed, and if you survived, it was considered a success story. Dental treatment, as mentioned before, was particularly direct. Tooth hurting. Remove it. Barber surgeons handled this, because why not combine haircuts and minor surgery? One-stop shop. You could trim your beard and lose a molar in the same visit. The tools were not delicate. The process was not gentle, but afterward, technically, the tooth no longer hurt. The empty socket might, but that was a new issue. Childbirth medicine deserves another quiet moment. Midwives were skilled through experience, not formal university training. They used herbal teas, oils, positioning techniques. Some methods genuinely helped. Others were more symbolic. Charms, prayers, relics placed nearby. The line between medicine and faith was thin, and when complications arose, there was often little anyone could do. Pain relief during labor was minimal. Religious teachings even suggested that suffering had spiritual value. So, enduring pain was not only normal, it was meaningful. Mental health, meanwhile, was interpreted through spiritual or humoral lenses. Depression might be labeled melancholy. Anxiety could be blamed on excess bile. Treatments included diet changes, more bloodletting, or spiritual counsel. Rest was sometimes prescribed, which, honestly, might have been the most effective intervention available. Let's drift to hospitals. Medieval hospitals were often attached to monasteries. They were places of care, yes, but also places of prayer. Cleanliness varied. Some were surprisingly organized. Others were crowded and basic. Patients lay in shared rooms. Privacy was not emphasized. Comfort was limited, but the intention was genuine. Care, even imperfect care, was offered. Pain relief options were limited, but not non-existent. Opium-based mixtures did exist. Mandrake root was used as a sedative. Alcohol was common, but dosage control was approximate. Too little did nothing. Too much did everything. It was a delicate balance, managed without measuring tools. So, pain was dulled occasionally, but rarely eliminated. And here's the strange part. Despite all this, medieval medicine was not foolish. It was logical within its framework. Without microscopes or modern chemistry, physicians worked with what they could observe. Patterns, symptoms, tradition. They built systems that made sense to them. It just turns out those systems sometimes involved removing a large percentage of your blood because you had a headache, so pain persisted. Sometimes reduced, sometimes intensified, but always present as a companion. Illness was not expected to be comfortable. Recovery was not expected to be quick. The human body was seen as fragile and temperamental. Treatment was interventionist in a very hands-on way. And as you lie there tonight, maybe feeling the subtle comfort of knowing that your worst medical inconvenience this week was probably manageable, just imagine the calm bravery required to face medieval healthcare, to trust a physician holding a blade, to sip a murky herbal brew and hope it was the helpful kind, to endure procedures without numbing, and to accept that pain was part of the process. Let's begin with grief. Because in the Middle Ages, grief was not a rare visitor. It was a long-term tenant. Infant mortality rates were high. In some regions, a shocking number of children did not survive past early childhood. Parents loved their children deeply. Despite what older historians once claimed, we have letters, poems, little shoes buried carefully beside tiny graves. The love was real, and so was the loss. But because death was common, grief had a different texture. It was expected. You mourned. Yes, you prayed. And then you continued. Fields still needed tending. Bread still needed baking. The rhythm of life did not pause for heartbreak. And this wasn't limited to peasants. Royal families lost children, frequently. Kings and queens, wrapped in silk and political anxiety, buried sons and daughters with heartbreaking regularity. Catherine of Aragon, for example, endured multiple pregnancy losses before Mary survived, and yet she carried on with court appearances and diplomatic grace. Because what was the alternative? Emotional devastation was folded into daily responsibility. Quietly, marriage, too, could be a source of steady emotional strain. Many marriages were arranged for political or economic reasons. Love sometimes grew. Sometimes it did not. A young noblewoman might be sent to a foreign court as a teenager, married to a man twice her age, expected to produce heirs quickly. Homesickness was normal. Isolation was normal. You smiled politely. You learned a new language. You adjusted. Emotional discomfort was simply part of your new job description. For peasants, marriage was often practical. Partnership meant survival. But that did not eliminate tension, financial stress, crop failures, harsh winters. These pressures strained relationships. Arguments were not uncommon, yet separation was difficult and socially discouraged. So couples endured. They worked side by side, even when affection was worn thin by exhaustion. Anxiety, though not labeled as such, was likely widespread. Imagine living with the constant uncertainty of harvest outcomes. A bad season could mean hunger. Disease outbreaks arrived without warning. Wars shifted borders unpredictably. There were no weather forecasts, no reliable safety nets. You relied on faith, community, and cautious optimism. And underlying it all was a hum of low-grade worry. But since everyone shared it, it felt less like anxiety and more like reality. Religion played a large role in shaping emotional experience. The medieval worldview emphasized sin, judgment, and the afterlife. For many, this was comforting. There was structure, meaning a plan. But it also carried emotional weight. People worried about their souls, about whether they had confessed properly, about purgatory. Guilt was not just personal, it was cosmic, and that quiet fear of eternal consequences sat gently but persistently in the background. Let's drift over to social hierarchy for a moment. Medieval society was deeply structured. You were born into a role, and upward mobility was limited. A peasant likely remained a peasant. A serf remained tied to land owned by someone else. That lack of choice was normal, but that doesn't mean it was emotionally light. Dreams, if they existed, had boundaries. Frustration had to be swallowed. Ambition was carefully managed. You worked within the system, because the system was not optional. Loneliness, too, had its place, especially among the elderly. If you survived into old age, which many did not, your body likely ached. Friends and siblings may have passed. Children might live far away or be consumed by their own responsibilities. There were no retirement communities, no structured elder care beyond family and church charity. Aging was respected in some ways, but it was also isolating. And yet, here's the subtle balance. Medieval life also had strong community bonds. Villages where people worked together, celebrated together, mourned together. Festivals punctuated the year. Shared rituals offered connection. Emotional pain was collective, not private. You did not suffer alone in your room scrolling through silent worries. You stood in church beside neighbors who carried similar burdens. Still, emotional expression was shaped by culture. Public displays of grief were often there were expectations about how long one should mourn, how loudly, how visibly. Excess could be frowned upon. Composure was valued, especially among elites. A queen did not collapse dramatically in front of ambassadors. She composed herself, even if her heart felt heavy as cathedral stone. Let's not forget fear. Not constant terror, just steady, low-level fear of illness, of famine, of political instability, of divine judgment. Fear was woven into sermons, into stories, into law. But again, because it was universal, it felt manageable. Shared fear becomes tradition. And perhaps the most fascinating part is that joy coexisted with all of this. Medieval people laughed. They told jokes. They fell in love. They danced at festivals. They wrote cheeky, marginal notes in manuscripts. Life was not grim darkness. It was textured. Pain was present, yes, but so was warmth. So, as you lie there now, in a world with its own quiet anxieties, just notice the contrast. Today, we often expect emotional comfort as a baseline. We seek fulfillment, stability, clarity. Medieval people sought survival, salvation, and maybe a decent harvest. Emotional discomfort was not something to eliminate. It was something to endure. Let's begin with religion, because medieval Europe, in particular, filtered almost everything through a spiritual lens. Pain was not random. It had meaning. Physical suffering could be seen as a test from God. Emotional hardship might refine your soul. Endurance was proof of faith, and this mindset changed how people interpreted their own discomfort. If your life hurt, perhaps that meant you were being shaped into something spiritually stronger, which is a very poetic way of coping with a toothache. Monks and nuns sometimes took this idea further. Some practiced forms of self-denial that would make modern wellness influencers quietly panic. Fasting was common. Sleeping on hard surfaces was common. Wearing simple, rough clothing was common. Comfort was not the goal. Spiritual clarity was. There were even individuals who engaged in deliberate self-discipline, believing that controlling bodily desires brought them closer to holiness. Now, not everyone did this, but the admiration for restraint and endurance was widespread. And here's the interesting part. This cultural respect for suffering wasn't limited to monasteries. It seeped into everyday life. A hard-working farmer who rose before dawn, labored tirelessly, and bore hardship without complaint was considered admirable. A noblewoman who endured a difficult marriage with grace was praised for her patience. Strength wasn't loud. It was quiet. It was stoic. It was the ability to carry discomfort, like it was simply another basket of grain. Let's gently float toward the world of knights. Because yes, even chivalry had its relationship with pain. Knights trained from childhood. Their armor was heavy. Their training was relentless. Bruises, sore muscles, minor injuries, these were normal. And the ideal knight did not dramatize them. He remained composed. Courage, after all, was not the absence of fear or pain. It was the ability to function while uncomfortable. Medieval masculinity was, in many ways, built on endurance. But women were also measured by endurance, just in different ways. Childbirth was framed not only as natural, but as a demonstration of strength and moral fortitude. A woman who endured labor calmly was praised. A queen who produced multiple heirs, despite repeated physical toll, was admired. Patience, resilience, quiet sacrifice. These qualities were woven into the ideal of femininity. Even illness could be interpreted through this lens. If someone bore chronic pain with composure, they were often seen as spiritually elevated. There are accounts of saints who endured long illnesses and were admired for their serenity. Suffering became intertwined with sanctity. The logic was simple. If life is full of unavoidable pain, then grace under pressure becomes the highest form of beauty. Now, of course, not everyone was serene all the time. Medieval people absolutely complained. We have records of it. Letters full of frustration. Marginal notes from scribes who were clearly over it. Court cases where neighbors argued loudly about property lines. Humans have always been human, but culturally, the ideal leaned toward acceptance rather than resistance. Let's drift briefly into fashion and beauty standards, because even there, discomfort played a role. Pale skin was admired among elites, signaling you did not labor outdoors. Achieving it sometimes meant avoiding sunlight almost entirely. High foreheads were fashionable at certain points, leading some women to pluck their hairlines. Corsets and stiff garments shaped the body according to aesthetic ideals. Beauty required tolerance. You did not prioritize ease. You prioritized appearance and status. And then there's the quiet pride in survival itself. If you lived through famine, plague, political upheaval, and harsh winters, you carried that endurance with you. Communities remembered resilience. Stories were told of ancestors who survived the hard year or the great sickness. Pain became part of identity, not as trauma in the modern psychological sense, but as proof of perseverance. What's fascinating is how this shaped expectations. Since pain was normalized and endurance admired, there was less cultural pressure to eliminate discomfort entirely. You adapted to it. You framed it as meaningful. You integrated it into your understanding of yourself. In some ways, this mindset offered stability. If suffering has purpose, then it is less chaotic, less arbitrary. But there's a quiet cost to that mindset too. When pain is glorified, relief can seem unnecessary, or even indulgent. If discomfort builds character, we soften it. And so improvements in hygiene, medicine, and labor conditions arrived slowly. Not because people enjoyed suffering, but because they had learned to live within it. As you lie there now, probably surrounded by small conveniences that medieval kings would envy, just consider how different the baseline is. Today, we seek optimization. Better sleep, better posture, better stress management. In the Middle Ages, optimization meant surviving winter and avoiding infection. The rest was secondary. And yet, there's something strangely steady about that worldview. When pain is expected, it loses some of its shock. When endurance is admired, even small acts of resilience feel meaningful. It's not better. It's not worse. It's simply different. Let's begin with winter. Medieval winter was not the cozy, candlelit fantasy we sometimes imagine. It was cold, deep, damp, bone level cold. Houses were insulated, modestly. Stone buildings, especially castles, were excellent at holding authority and terrible at holding heat. Fireplaces helped, but they warmed to the immediate area. If you stepped 3 feet away, congratulations, you were back in medieval refrigeration. Fingers cracked, toes numbed. Breath visible indoors. People slept in layers, sometimes wearing hats to bed. Frostbite was not unheard of in harsher regions. But again, this wasn't considered extraordinary. It was winter, of course. You can't feel your fingertips. Why would you? For peasants, winter brought reduced food supplies. Diets leaned heavily on preserved meats, grains, and whatever root vegetables survived storage. Fresh produce was a distant memory. Nutritional variety shrank, energy dipped. Illness spread more easily in crowded indoor spaces. Coughs echoed through villages. Joints stiffened in the cold. Arthritis, already common from years of labor, felt particularly dramatic in January. But there was no heated yoga class to attend. You flexed your fingers near the fire and continued knitting, mending, or carving wood. Let's drift gently into spring. Ah, spring, the hopeful season, the mud season. As snow melted and rain arrived, roads transformed into thick, sticky obstacles. Travel became slower and messier. Shoes absorbed moisture, feet stayed damp for long stretches, and damp feet, as it turns out, are not particularly cheerful. Skin cracked. Fungal infections were not uncommon, but the fields needed planting. So into the mud they went, sloshing forward with determination and slightly irritated ankles. Spring also meant the return of agricultural labor in full force. After winter's relative stillness, bodies were suddenly reintroduced to long hours of plowing and planting. Muscles protested. Hands blistered anew. The first weeks of intense labor likely felt like a medieval version of overdoing it at the gym after a long break. Except there was no gentle recovery period. The crops would not wait for your hamstrings to feel emotionally ready. Now, let's float into summer. Bright, busy, and occasionally brutal. Medieval summers could be intensely hot, especially during periods known as the medieval warm period. Without modern ventilation or cooling systems, indoor spaces trapped heat. Outdoor laborers worked beneath direct sun with limited protection. Sunburn was common. Dehydration, too. Clean drinking water was not always easily accessible in the fields. Heat exhaustion was not labeled as such, but the symptoms were there. Dizziness, fatigue, headaches. You probably just called it feeling unwell and kept harvesting. Summer also brought insects, mosquitoes, fleas, flies. With no effective repellents, bites were constant. Skin itched persistently. Sleeping in warmer months meant windows or shutters open, inviting in both breeze and bugs. Scratching quietly in the dark was practically a nightly ritual. And of course, warmer weather also accelerated food spoilage. Stomach issues increased. Mild food poisoning may have been so common that it barely raised eyebrows. Let's not forget the smell factor. In cities especially, summer heat intensified everything. Waste disposal systems were limited. Streets carried a mixture of animal remains, refuse, and runoff. The air could be memorable, which, while not technically pain, certainly contributed to the general sensory discomfort of daily life. Headaches likely followed. But again, normal. Now autumn, harvest season. Physically demanding, repetitive, relentless. Long days gathering crops before the cold returned. Backspending, again and again. Hands cutting, lifting, bundling. The urgency added pressure. A failed harvest meant hunger in winter, so fatigue was layered with anxiety. Bodies strained. Sleep came quickly, but not always comfortably. Muscles ached in that deep, satisfying yet slightly alarming way. Seasonal illness patterns also shifted. Respiratory infections were more common in colder months. Gastrointestinal issues spiked in warmer months. There was a rhythm to it. People expected to feel worse at certain times of year. If winter arrived and you didn't have at least one lingering cough, were you even participating? And through all of this, clothing adjusted only so much. Layering in winter helped, but wool remained itchy. In summer, lighter fabrics were limited. Sweat soaked into garments. Laundry was labor-intensive, so clothing wasn't washed as frequently as modern standards might demand. Skin irritation followed naturally. But if everyone around you also felt mildly uncomfortable in their own clothes, it simply blended into the background. The seasons also shaped emotional experience. Winter's darkness could feel heavy. Less sunlight. More confinement indoors. Though they didn't label it seasonal depression, the psychological shift likely existed. Spring brought renewed hope, but also renewed work. Summer brought energy and exhaustion in equal measure. Autumn carried urgency and reflection. Each season layered its own emotional tone onto the physical discomfort. What's fascinating is how deeply people adapted to this rhythm. There was no expectation of climate control. You prepared. You endured. You adjusted your daily patterns to the sun's schedule. Life was not separated from nature. It was immersed in it, which meant nature had full permission to be inconvenient. So, as you lie there now, perhaps feeling perfectly regulated, air moving gently around you, just imagine the medieval baseline. Too cold. Too hot. Too damp. Too dry. Slightly itchy. Slightly sore. Slightly tired. And yet, still functioning. Still building cathedrals. Still composing poetry. Still falling in love and arguing over fences. Now, medieval beds were not universally terrible, but they were rarely luxurious. For peasants, mattresses were often sacks filled with straw or hay. Over time, that straw shifted, flattened, and occasionally poked. It needed regular replacing, because it absorbed moisture and, well, life. Fleas and mites were not uncommon guests. You did not dramatically strip the bed and sanitize it. You accepted that you were sharing your sleeping arrangement with a few tiny roommates. Nobles had better beds. Technically, feather mattresses existed. Heavy curtains surrounded the bed to trap warmth. It looked impressive. Regal. Slightly theatrical, but those curtains also trapped smoke from fireplaces and the general scent of medieval living. Ventilation was limited. So yes, the bed was grand. It was also gently suffocating. Let's talk about privacy, because medieval households, especially among common people, where entire families often slept in the same room, sometimes in the same bed. Personal space was not a concept anyone was aggressively defending. If someone snored, if someone tossed and turned, it was a group experience. And since physical labor left, most people deeply tired. Sleep came quickly, but not always smoothly. Night itself was different. Darkness in the Middle Ages was real darkness. Once candles were out, that was it. No street lights, no glowing electronics, just thick, quiet blackness. And medieval people often practiced something called segmented sleep. They would sleep for a few hours, wake up naturally in the middle of the night, sit quietly, pray, talk softly, maybe even do light tasks, and then return to sleep. This wasn't insomnia. It was normal. The body followed a rhythm shaped by sunset and sunrise, not alarm clocks. But comfort during that sleep was not guaranteed. Winter nights were cold. Even with layers and shared body heat, fingers and toes could numb. Summer nights, on the other hand, brought insects. Mosquitoes hummed gently in the dark. Fleas made their presence known. You might wake up, scratching, and you would not dramatically declare war on the mattress. You would simply sigh and continue. Bathing before bed was not a nightly ritual for most people. Full baths required significant effort. Water had to be carried and heated, so daily washing, especially in colder months, was limited to hands and face. Skin carried the residue of the day's labor. Sweat, smoke, dust. Again, normal. Cleanliness standards were different. Comfort expectations were different. Let's drift to illness at night. Without modern pain relief, nighttime could amplify discomfort. A toothache felt louder in the quiet dark. A cough echoed more sharply. Fever dreams were intense and often interpreted spiritually. If you were unwell, You endured it with herbal mixtures at your bedside, and perhaps a whispered prayer. There was number 24-hour pharmacy run. No glowing screen to distract you. Just you and the rhythm of your breathing. Even the sounds of the night were different. Animals outside, wind through wooden shutters, the occasional distant howl. For people accustomed to it, these sounds were background noise, but they were present. Always present. Silence, as we understand it, was rare. Nature had opinions. And yet, despite all this, medieval people slept deeply, often. Physical exhaustion from labor likely overpowered many discomforts. When your body has been plowing fields or hauling water all day, it doesn't negotiate much. It collapses. There is something almost peaceful about that inevitability. No scrolling, no late-night overthinking about emails, just darkness and fatigue. Now, here's the gentle irony. For a society so familiar with pain, aching joints, smoky eyes, sore hands, sleep was still considered a gift. Religious texts speak of it as mercy, a reset. Even in discomfort, rest was valued. It was the quiet space between days of endurance. And that brings us softly to the end of this journey. We've wandered through aching teeth and stiff backs, through leeches and labor, through grief, endurance, cold winters, hot summers, and finally to a bed that may or may not poke you in the ribs. Medieval life was not constant agony, but it was layered with discomfort in ways we no longer consider normal. Pain was expected. Endurance admired. Relief, when it came, was appreciated deeply. Let's slowly drift back to the 13th century, when horsemen from the Mongolian steppe decided to gently reorganize most of Eurasia. Casually. Because, why not? This is the story of the Pax Mongolica, the so-called Mongol peace. A time when ideas traveled freely, and entire cities quietly reconsidered their life choices after hearing distant hoofbeats. It's soothing in hindsight, less so at the time. To understand this peace, we have to float back to a man who did not wake up one morning thinking, I shall promote cross-cultural exchange. His name was Temujin. You probably know him as Genghis Khan. He was not born into comfort. He was not born into stability. He was born into the Mongolian steppe, where survival was a hobby everyone practiced daily. His father was poisoned. His family was abandoned by their clan, and little Temujin grew up learning two key lessons: trust no one, and always double down, which he did, impressively. By his 20s, he had begun uniting rival tribes. By his 40s, he had created the largest contiguous land empire the world had ever seen. Casual. Now, here's the ironic part. Genghis Khan is often remembered for destruction. And yes, cities burned, armies fell. Bureaucrats had very bad weeks. But once the conquering settled, and it always settled, eventually something unusual happened. The Mongols did not just pillage and leave. They organized, they taxed, they protected trade routes, they standardized systems. They made sure that if you were a merchant traveling from China to Persia, you could theoretically do so without being robbed every 15 minutes, which, for the 13th century, was basically revolutionary customer service. The empire stretched from Korea to Eastern Europe. That's not a metaphor. That's an actual map-covering sprawl of land connected by Mongol administration, and within that space, something quietly remarkable began to form. Caravans moved silk, spices, silver, porcelain, and ideas across thousands of miles. Scholars traveled. Diplomats traveled. Even missionaries traveled. If you were brave enough, you could cross continents under Mongol protection. You just needed the proper paperwork. Yes, paperwork. The Mongols issued passports called peza, little tablets that guaranteed safe passage. It was medieval TSA, but on horseback. Let's gently glide over to the sons and grandsons of Genghis Khan. Because of course, there were many. The empire was divided into khanates, ruled by family members who all technically answered to a great Khan. In theory, this was harmonious. In reality, it was a sprawling family group chat with military resources. In China, Kublai Khan established the Yuan dynasty. In Persia, the the Ilkhanate took shape. In Russia, the Golden Horde settled in, and despite occasional family disagreements, which sometimes involved armies, the broader trade network held together for over a century, which is impressive, considering most royal families struggled to share a dinner table. Under Mongol rule, merchants thrived. They were not romanticized heroes. They were practical people who understood profit. The Mongols respected that. In fact, they often taxed trade instead of land, because nomadic rulers found farmland somewhat inconvenient. Trade was mobile. Trade was efficient. Trade made money. And money meant stability. So the Silk Road, that ancient network of trade routes, entered a golden age. Goods moved faster. Information moved faster. Even technologies moved faster. Gunpowder drifted west. Paper currency concepts drifted around. Printing techniques traveled. It was globalization before anyone had a word for it. Of course, this was not a utopia. The Pax Mongolica did not mean everyone suddenly held hands and sang step lullabies. It meant the Mongols enforced order with a quiet understanding that disobedience would be handled firmly. Very firmly. But compared to the chaos of constant regional warfare, Mongol-controlled territory could feel oddly predictable. Taxes were consistent. Laws were enforced. Religious tolerance was surprisingly broad. Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, and others were generally allowed to practice freely. The Mongols themselves were spiritually flexible. They were less interested in theology and more interested in loyalty, which, honestly, simplified things. And then there is the fascinating irony of connection, because while the Pax Mongolica made trade safer, it also made disease more efficient. Routes that carried silk and silver also carried bacteria. The Black Death would later move along these same networks in the 14th century, traveling from Asia into Europe with devastating effect. So yes, the Mongols accidentally accelerated one of history's most catastrophic pandemics, not on purpose. Just as a side effect of building the medieval super, it's one of history's quieter ironies. Unity can be both blessing and burden. Meanwhile, in far-off Europe, travelers like Marco Polo wandered east and marveled at the sophistication of Kublai Khan's court. Polo described grand cities, paper money, efficient postal systems. Europeans listening back home probably blinked slowly and thought, paper, money. It sounded suspiciously modern, but it was real. The Mongol Empire was not just tents and horses. It was administration. It was communication networks. It was relay stations spaced across vast distances so messages could travel with startling speed. Imagine medieval express shipping, because yes, they had that too. But like all vast dynasties held together by family ambition, cracks formed. Succession disputes grew louder. Regional rulers became more independent. The unity that made the Pax Mongolica possible slowly thinned. By the mid-14th century, internal conflicts and external pressures weakened Mongol control. Trade routes became less secure. The great interconnected web began to fray. And just like that, the Mongol peace drifted into memory. Not with a dramatic explosion, just a gradual loosening. Still, for about a century, something extraordinary had happened. A nomadic empire created a corridor of relative stability across Eurasia. Cultures met. Economies intertwined. Ideas traveled farther than ever before. It was messy. It was imperfect. It was occasionally catastrophic. But it reshaped the medieval world in ways that quietly set the stage for the modern one. Let's gently step inside one of the most powerful households on Earth. Because while the Pax Mongolica sounds like a grand geopolitical concept, it was, in reality, held together by a family. A very large, very ambitious, occasionally passive-aggressive family. And at the center of it all, at least for a while, sat Kublai Khan. Kublai was the grandson of Genghis Khan, which is a heavy title to carry. Imagine introducing yourself at family gatherings. Oh, I'm just Genghis Khan's grandson. No pressure, just uphold the largest empire in recorded history. Keep trade flowing. Don't embarrass the ancestors. Standard expectations. Unlike his grandfather, who thrived on open-steppe warfare, Kublai leaned into administration. He grew up watching conquest. Yes, but he also absorbed something else: the value of settled governance. He understood that ruling China required more than cavalry charges. It required bureaucracy, paperwork, accountants, which, let's be honest, is a very different aesthetic from thundering across grasslands with a composite bow. When Kublai declared himself Great Khan in 1260, it did not go smoothly. Of course, it didn't. Mongol succession was never a calm handover. It was more of a convince everyone you deserve it, or bring enough soldiers situation. His brother Arik Bakay also claimed the title. What followed was, essentially, a civil war between siblings, because nothing says dynastic unity like mobilizing armies against your own brother. Eventually, Kublai won, but the victory quietly weakened the illusion of perfect Mongol cohesion. Still, once secure, Kublai turned his attention toward China. And here is where things become quietly fascinating. Instead of ruling as an outsider forever, he embraced elements of Chinese statecraft. In 1271, he declared the Yuan dynasty. Yes, an official Chinese dynasty. The Mongol conqueror rebranded himself as a legitimate emperor of China. It was bold, it was strategic, and it confused absolutely everyone who still thought Mongols were just tent-dwelling nomads. He built a capital at Khambalik, modern-day Beijing. It was grand, organized, cosmopolitan. Merchants from across Asia arrived. Scholars debated philosophy. Engineers built canals, and somewhere in the palace, Kublai likely sighed deeply while reviewing tax reports. Because ruling China meant managing tens of millions of people. That is, a lot of census data for a former steppe warrior. Kublai tried to balance Mongol identity with Chinese tradition. Mongols remained at the top of the social hierarchy. Foreigners from Central Asia often held privileged positions. Northern Chinese ranked below them. Southern Chinese ranked below that. It was not exactly subtle. Stability sometimes meant reminding everyone who was in charge. But Kublai also supported infrastructure, promoted trade, and maintained religious tolerance. Buddhists, Muslims, Christians all found space at his court. He seemed genuinely curious about ideas. Power, yes, but ideas too. And then, of course, there was Marco Polo, the Venetian traveler, who arrived at Kublai's court and later wrote extensively about it. Whether every detail was accurate is debated. Medieval travel memoirs were not peer-reviewed. But Polo described paper money, efficient postal systems, and the sheer wealth of the Yuan court. For Europeans reading his account, it sounded almost mythical. A ruler issuing paper currency, a state-sponsored relay network. It felt futuristic. Meanwhile, Kublai was just running his empire, casually modern. But let's not imagine endless smooth sailing, because ruling a massive empire is exhausting. Kublai launched ambitious military campaigns beyond China into Vietnam, Japan, and Java. Some succeeded, others did not. The attempted invasions of Japan in 1274 and 1281 famously failed, thanks in part to the Japanese later called them kamikaze. Divine winds. From Kublai's perspective, it was likely more of a frustrated stare at storm clouds. Even empires have weather problems. And while he managed statecraft impressively, the personal side of dynastic life remained messy. The Mongol Empire was technically unified under the Great Khan, but the other Khanates, the Elk, the Golden Horde, the Chagatai Khanate, increasingly operated independently. Cousins ruled cousins, alliances shifted. Communications stretched thin across continents. The idea of one harmonious Mongol family began to feel more ceremonial than practical. Kublai aged. He grew heavier. He reportedly struggled with gout. Court life replaced the mobility of youth. The once nomadic conquerors were now palace-dwelling administrators. There is something quietly poetic about that shift. The empire that began on horseback slowly settled into architecture and ledgers. Movement became management. When Kublai died in 1294, he left behind an enormous state. But he also left behind a delicate structure. The Yuan dynasty would continue, but internal tensions simmered. Mongol elites struggled to fully integrate with Chinese society. Economic pressures mounted. Natural disasters strained legitimacy. The mandate of heaven, that elusive Chinese concept of divine approval, is not particularly patient with foreign dynasties. And so, while the Pax Mongolica still hummed along in many regions, subtle cracks widened. Trade continued. Caravans still crossed Central Asia. But political unity grew thinner. The Golden Horde in Russia charted its own course. The Ilkhanate in Persia developed distinct cultural identities. The Mongol Empire was no longer one roaring entity. It was several powerful siblings living separate lives, occasionally sending postcards. Yet for a time, under Kublai, the world felt interconnected in ways it never had before. You could travel from Venice to Beijing. If you were brave, wealthy, and very patient under the protection of a single imperial system, ideas flowed, art styles blended. Even cuisine absorbed influences. Noodles met new spices. Textiles crossed mountains. It was a quiet weaving together of continents. And here is the sleepy irony. The Mongols, once feared as unstoppable destroyers, became facilitators of exchange. They did not set out to create a golden age of trade. They set out to win. But in winning, they built roads. They secured routes. They unintentionally stitched Eurasia into a closer fabric. So as we let the image of Kublai's court fade, lantern light flickering against palace walls, consider the strangeness of history. A nomadic empire settles into bureaucracy. A conqueror becomes an emperor. A family feud becomes a global network. And for one long century, peace, enforced, structured, slightly tense peace, allows the world to talk to itself. Let's float west now, away from Kublai's paper money and palace banquets, away from Beijing Essay Grand avenues, and into the colder, flatter lands of the Russian steppes, where another branch of the Mongol family was quietly perfecting something far less glamorous: tax collection. This was the domain of the Golden Horde, a name that sounds dramatic, almost glamorous, but in practice it meant Mongol rulers overseeing vast stretches of what is now Russia, Ukraine, and parts of Eastern Europe. The founder of this Western Empire was Beito Khan, a grandson of Genghis, because of course he was. The Mongol Empire was essentially a multi-continental family enterprise. Beito arrived in Eastern Europe in the 1230s with a very clear agenda: conquer first, organize later. Cities like Kiev faced devastating sieges. European princes blinked in confusion at the speed and coordination of Mongol cavalry. Chroniclers described it with awe and dread. But once the dust settled, and it did settle, something interesting happened. The Mongols did not completely replace local rulers. Instead, they made them pay. Russian princes were allowed to keep their thrones. They just had to travel, hat in hand, to the Mongol court to receive a yarlik, an official patent confirming their right to rule. It was medieval licensing. You want to be Grand Prince? Wonderful. Please secure Mongol approval and remit your taxes on time. Thank you. The Horde preferred tribute over constant occupation. It was efficient. It kept resistance manageable, and it required far fewer garrisons. The Mongols established their capital at Sarai, near the Volga River. It became a surprisingly cosmopolitan city. Merchants from Central Asia mingled with Slavic traders. Islamic scholars debated theology. Diplomats passed through. This was not a barbaric wasteland. It was a node in the Pax Mongolica network. Trade flowed along the Volga. Silver moved. Furs moved. Grain, mobeth, and always taxes moved. Let's pause gently on that system, because the Golden Horde was less interested in micromanaging daily life and more interested in predictable revenue. Census taking became important. Record keeping mattered. Local elites were responsible for collecting tribute from their own people and forwarding it along. It created a layered hierarchy of responsibility. If peasants grumbled, they grumbled at their princes. If princes failed, the Mongols noticed. It was indirect rule at its most practical. Now here's the subtle irony. Mongol domination in Russia, often called the Mongol yoke, is remembered as a heavy burden. And yes, it restricted political independence, but it also connected Russian territories to a wider Eurasian trade network. Russian merchants gained access to markets stretching deep into Asia. Diplomatic practices evolved. Even administrative habits shifted under Mongol influence. Sometimes, influence does not shout, it simply lingers. Religion remained relatively untouched. The Mongols, as usual, practiced pragmatic tolerance. The Russian Orthodox Church was allowed to function. In fact, it often received tax exemptions. A clever move. Religious leaders who are not taxed tend to appreciate the arrangement, and appreciation can translate into calm subjects. The Horde understood this balance. Loyalty mattered more than uniformity. Of course, the Golden Horde itself was not immune to family tension. Succession disputes simmered. Rival claimants maneuvered. The broader Mongol world was fracturing into increasingly independent khanates. Communication across thousands of miles grew complicated. Cousins in Persia did not always align with cousins on the Volga. The idea of a single great Khan began to feel symbolic rather than authoritative. And then, slowly, something shifted in the Russian lands. One principality began to rise in quiet efficiency. Moscow. Its princes proved particularly skilled at navigating Mongol politics. They collected tribute faithfully. They cultivated favor. They positioned themselves as indispensable intermediaries. It was not dramatic. It was patient. Moscow grew wealthier and more powerful under Mongol oversight, ironically because it cooperated so well. As decades passed, the Golden Horde converted to Islam under Khan Uzburg in the early 14th century. This added another layer to its identity. The Horde became deeply integrated into the Islamic world, strengthening ties with Central Asia and the Middle East. Trade networks expanded further. Cultural exchanges deepened. The Pax Mongolica was no longer just a Mongol story. It was a Eurasian tapestry of faiths, languages, and economic ambitions. But stability is delicate. The Black Death, traveling along the same trade arteries that enriched the empire, struck hard in the mid-14th century. Cities declined, populations shrank. Revenues faltered. Internal conflicts intensified. The Golden Horde fractured into smaller competing states. Authority weakened. Tribute became harder to enforce, and Moscow, once the compliant tax collector, began asserting independence. In 1380, the Battle of Kulikovo marked a symbolic turning point as Russian forces challenged Mongol authority. It was not the immediate end. That would take another century, but the psychological shift had begun. By 1480, at the Great Stand on the Ugra River, Mongol dominance over Moscow effectively ended. The Horde had thinned into history, and yet, for over 2 centuries, the Golden Horde maintained a vast region within the Pax Mongolica framework. Trade thrived. Communication flowed. Diplomatic norms evolved. It was not gentle rule. It was not sentimental. But it was structured, and structure, even when imposed, can create unexpected connections. So as we let the Volga River drift quietly through our imagination, think of caravans crossing open plains. Think of Russian princes nervously rehearsing their tribute presentations. Think of Mongol officials tallying silver with calm precision. The Golden Horde was not flashy like Kublai's court. It did not boast Venetian travelers writing best-selling memoirs. But it was a pillar of the Mongol peace. And as one branch of the family managed forests and furs in the west, another branch shaped Persia in the south. Now, let's drift south, away from the cold winds of the Russian plains, down toward Persia, toward cities with domes, tiled courtyards, and poets who could make heartbreak sound elegant. This is where another branch of the Mongol family settled, the Ilkhanate. And if the Golden Horde specialized in tax efficiency, the Ilkhans specialized in cultural transformation, because sometimes conquerors wake up and realize they've absorbed the very world they meant to dominate. The Ilkhanate was founded by Hulagu Khan, another grandson of Gen. You may remember him as the Mongol who captured Baghdad in 1258. Yes, that Baghdad, the great Abbasid capital. It was a monumental event, the symbolic end of centuries of Abbasid caliphal authority. Chroniclers describe devastation, libraries lost, institutions shattered. It was one of those turning points that historians speak about in very measured tones. But here's the twist. After the conquest, the Mongols did not simply flatten Persia and ride away. They stayed. The Irulit. They attempted to administer an incredibly sophisticated region with deep intellectual and bureaucratic traditions. Persia was not an empty canvas. It was layered, and slowly, almost awkwardly, the Mongol rulers began adapting. Hulagu himself was religiously eclectic. His court included Christians, Buddhists, and Muslims. He had alliances with Christian powers in the region. It was a diplomatic mosaic, but his successors gradually leaned more into Islamic identity, and here is where the transformation becomes almost poetic. In 1295, Ghazan Khan, one of Hulag's successors, converted to Islam. Not symbolically, not half-heartedly. Fully, he adopted Islamic governance norms and integrated Persian administrative systems more deeply into Mongol rule. Imagine being a nomadic warrior lineage and, within a few generations, presiding over Persian scholars, discussing theology in your court. History moves quietly like that sometimes. Ghazan initiated reforms. He standardized coinage. He reorganized tax systems. He attempted to curb corruption. Yes, corruption. Because vast empires tend to attract ambitious officials with flexible ethics. Ghazan's reforms were an effort to stabilize finances and reassure subjects that Mongol rule could be structured rather than chaotic. It was governance by spreadsheet, medieval edition. Under the Ilkhanate, cities like Tabriz, trade routes, linked Persia to China and the Mediterranean. Art blended Mongol motifs with Persian aesthetics. Manuscripts from this period are stunning, vibrant miniatures, combining steppe influences with intricate Persian detail. It was not forced assimilation. It was cultural fusion, the Pax Mongolica in artistic form. And yet, the Ilkhanate had its share of dynastic tension. Succession was never straightforward. Mongol tradition emphasized family legitimacy. But Persia had its own expectations of kingship. Balancing nomadic heritage with settled monarchy required constant adjustment. Some rulers managed it gracefully, others less so. There were intrigues, there were court rivalries, there were ambitious nobles, calculating outcomes in candlelit rooms. Calm on the surface, restless underneath. Economically, the Ilkhanate benefited enormously from its position within the Mongol network. Silk flowed west, silver flowed east. Diplomats traveled between Persia and Yuan China. Letters crossed thousands of miles with surprising speed. It is easy to forget how revolutionary that was. Information moving across continents within a single imperial framework. No need to negotiate passage at every border. The Pax Mongolica made Eurasia feel smaller, but the Black Death again whispered its quiet disruption. Trade networks that brought wealth also carried plague. Persia suffered. Populations declined, revenues shrank, political cohesion weakened, and without strong central leadership, the Ilkhanate began to fragment. In the mid-14th century. Rival claimants rose. Regional powers asserted autonomy. The Mongol imprint remained, but unified authority dissolved. What fascinates historians, and perhaps should gently fascinate us tonight, is how quickly identity shifted. Within decades, Mongol elites in Persia spoke Persian, patronized Persian art, practiced Islam, sponsored scholars. The conquerors became patrons of the conquered culture. Not entirely, not completely, but meaningfully. It is one of history's softer ironies. The empire that began on horseback ended up funding miniature paintings and theological debates. And if we zoom out slowly, we see the broader pattern. In China, the Mongols adapted to imperial bureaucracy. In Russia, they shaped tribute systems and political evil. In Persia, they merged with Islamic governance and artistic life. The Pax Mongolica was not uniform. It was flexible. It bent to local traditions while maintaining overarching connectivity. Of course, flexibility has limits. Without a strong Great Khan binding the branches together, each Khanate drifted. Communication thinned. Loyalty became regional. The grand unity of Genghis Khan's vision faded into separate political entities, still connected by trade, still influenced by shared heritage, but no longer a single coordinated force. And yet, for a luminous century, Persia was tied directly to China under one imperial umbrella. A merchant could move from Tabriz to Beijing with relative confidence. A scholar could hear news from distant courts. Artistic styles traveled, scientific knowledge traveled. Even culinary habits traveled. Somewhere in that exchange, noodles likely met because history is sometimes shaped by quiet kitchen experiments. So as we let the domes of Tabriz soften into the night, think of the Ilkhans not as distant conquerors, but as rulers navigating identity in a vast, interconnected world. They began as outsiders. They became insiders. They started as steppe warriors. They ended as Persian monarchs, funding manuscripts. Now we come to the softest and perhaps most ironic ending to our long ride across Eurasia. No dramatic final battle. No last stand beneath stormy skies, whose movement. Quiet, steady movement along the same roads that once carried silk, spices, silver. Optimissim. The Pax Mongolica had stitched together a vast world. Caravans moved from China to Persia. Ships linked ports across the Indian Ocean. Merchants traveled under Mongol protection with official tablets guaranteeing safe passage. It was efficient. It was structured. It was, by medieval standards, astonishingly connected, and connection, as we know, has side effects. Sometime in the early 14th century, deep in Central Asia, a bacterium began traveling. Not with intent, not with politics, just with fleas, rats, and trade goods. The disease we now call the Black Death moved quietly along caravan routes. It followed the rhythm of commerce. It paused in cities. It boarded ships. It crossed mountains. The Mongols did not create it, but they had created the roads it needed. There is a stillness to this realization. The same imperial network that allowed Marco Polo to wander east also allowed plague to wander west. By the 1340s, outbreaks appeared in trading hubs. In 1346, the disease reached the Black Sea port of Kafafeh. From there, ships carried it into the Mediterranean. Europe, already politically fragmented and medically unprepared, struggled to understand what was happening. Within a few years, millions were gone. Entire communities changed shape. Labor shortages altered economies. Religious anxieties deepened. Social structures strained. And back in Mongol territories, the impact was equally trade slowed. Tax revenues shrank. Armies weakened. Communication faltered. The Pax Mongolica had depended on stability, on predictable movement, on functioning cities and reliable tribute. The plague disrupted all of that. It was not a conqueror with banners. It was not a rival Khan with ambitions. It was simply biology exploiting connectivity. And so, almost gently, the Mongol world began to thin. The Yuan dynasty in China faced rebellions fueled by economic hardship and natural disasters. The Ilkhanate in Persia fragmented after leadership crises and declining revenues. The Golden Horde fractured into competing factions. There was no single dramatic collapse, just gradual loosening, threads pulling apart. In China, by 1368, the Yuan dynasty fell to the Ming. The Mongol rulers retreated northward to the steppe. In Persia, successor states replaced unified Ilkhan rule. In Russia, Mongol authority faded as local powers, especially Moscow, asserted independence. The vast empire of Genghis Khan became memory, then legend. But here is the quiet thing worth resting on tonight. Even as political unity dissolved, the connections did not vanish completely. Trade routes remained. Cultural exchanges had already reshaped societies. Technologies had moved. Ideas had crossed boundaries that once felt insurmountable. The world had, for a century, learned how interconnected it could be. The Pax Mongolica was never soft. It began with conquest. It was enforced with discipline. But it created corridors of exchange across continents. It allowed a merchant in Venice to hear of Beijing. It allowed Persian art to carry Mongol motifs. It allowed Russian princes to operate within a Eurasian diplomatic framework. And yes, it allowed disease to travel. History is rarely selective about what it carries forward. So as we gently close this chapter, imagine the steppe once more. Wide, open, quiet. The horses still there, the wind still moving across grasslands. The empire that once commanded from Korea to Hungary, no longer unified, but its imprint lingering. Roads remain even when rulers fade. The Pax Mongolica was not peaceful in the way we use the word today. It was structured dominance that created space for exchange. It was a century when Eurasia briefly operated within one overarching system. And then, as all human systems eventually do, it shifted. It loosened. It passed on. And now, as we let that vast connected world settle into the background, we can rest with the simple rhythm of history itself. Empires rise. They organize. They connect. They unravel. And somewhere in between, they change the world in ways even they could not predict. For tonight, we leave the Mongol roads behind. Quiet, dusty, still stretching toward horizons that no longer answered to a single Khan. Now we come to the softest, and perhaps most ironic, ending to our long ride across Eurasia. No dramatic final battle. No last stand beneath stormy skies hoosed movement. Quiet, steady movement along the same roads that once carried silk, spices, silver, and optimism. The Pax Mongolica had stitched together a vast world. Caravans moved from China to Persia. Ships linked ports across the Indian Ocean. Merchants traveled under Mongol protection with official tablets guaranteeing safe passage. It was efficient. It was structured. It was, by medieval standards, astonishingly connected. And connection, as we know, has side effects. Sometime in the early 14th century, deep in Central Asia, a bacterium began traveling. Not with intent, not with politics, just with fleas, rats, and trade goods. The disease we now call the Black Death moved quietly along caravan routes. It followed the rhythm of commerce. It paused in cities. It boarded ships. It crossed mountains. The Mongols did not create it, but they had created the roads it needed. There is a stillness to this realization. The same imperial network that allowed Marco Polo to wander east also allowed plague to wander west. By the 1340s, outbreaks appeared in trading hubs. In 1346, the disease reached the Black Sea port of Kafafay. From there, ships carried it into the Mediterranean. Europe, already politically fragmented and medically unprepared, struggled to understand what was happening. Within a few years, millions were gone. Entire communities changed shape. Labor shortages altered economies. Religious anxieties deepened. Social structures strained. And back in Mongol territories, the impact was equally deep. Trade slowed. Tax revenues shrank. Armies weakened. Communication faltered. The Pax Mongolica had depended on stability, on predictable movement, on functioning cities and reliable tribute. The plague disrupted all of that. It was not a conqueror with banners. It was not a rival Khan with ambitions. It was simply biology exploiting connectivity. And so, almost gently, the Mongol world began to thin. The Yuan dynasty in China faced rebellions fueled by economic hardship and natural disasters. The Ilkhanate in Persia fragmented after leadership crises and declining revenues. The Golden Horde fractured into competing factions. There was no single dramatic collapse, just gradual loosening, threads pulling apart. In China, by 1368, the Yuan dynasty fell to the Ming. The Mongol rulers retreated northward to the steppe. In Persia, successor states replaced unified Ilkhan rule. In Russia, Mongol authority faded as local powers, especially Moscow, asserted independence. The vast empire of Genghis Khan became memory, then legend. But here is the quiet thing worth resting on tonight. Even as political unity dissolved, the connections did not vanish completely. Trade routes remained. Cultural exchanges had already reshaped societies. Technologies had moved. Ideas had crossed boundaries that once felt insurmountable. The world had, for a century, learned how interconnected it could be. The Pax Mongolica was never soft. It began with conquest. It was enforced with discipline. But it created corridors of exchange across continents. It allowed a merchant in Venice to hear of Beijing. It allowed Persian art to carry Mongol motifs. It allowed Russian princes to operate within a Eurasian diplomatic framework. And yes, it allowed disease to travel. History is rarely selective about what it carries forward. So as we gently close this chapter, imagine the steppe once more. Wide, open, quiet. The horses still there, the wind still moving across grasslands. The empire that once commanded from Korea to Hungary, no longer unified, but its imprint lingering. Roads remain even when rulers fade. The Pax Mongolica was not peaceful in the way we use the word today. It was structured dominance that created space for exchange. It was a century when Eurasia briefly operated within one overarching system. And then, as all human systems eventually do, it shifted. It loosened. It passed on. And now, as we let that vast connected world settle into the background, we can rest with the simple rhythm of history itself. Empires rise. They organize. They connect. They unravel. And somewhere in between, they change the world in ways even they could not predict. For tonight, we leave the Mongol roads behind. Quiet, dusty, still stretching toward horizons that no longer answered to a single Khan. Let the world be noisy somewhere else, because tonight, we're drifting back to ancient theaters. 2 stone benches, 2 masks with frozen expressions, 2 actors who are very committed, and audiences who are even more committed to judging them. Gently, of course. So take a slow breath. Imagine warm Mediterranean air. The hum of a crowd settling in, someone nearby arguing about olives, and you are sitting on cool stone, waiting for a tragedy that will absolutely ruin someone's fictional life in the most poetic way possible. Ancient theater was not subtle, but it was oddly soothing. Let's begin in ancient Greece, because of course we are. The Greeks did not invent drama as a concept. Humans have always enjoyed gossiping about other humans in exaggerated ways. But the Greeks formalized it. They built enormous outdoor theaters carved into hillsides, because when you're going to explore existential despair, you may as well have excellent acoustics. The theater of Dionysus in Athens could hold around 14,000 people. That's 14,000 citizens sitting together to watch someone yell about fate. Calmly, in verse. These performances were part of religious festivals honoring Dionysus, the god of wine, ecstasy, and because nothing says spiritual devotion like watching a king discover he has accidentally married his mother. The festival was competitive. Playwrights submitted tragedies. Judges voted. The crowd reacted. It was basically the ancient version of a very slow, poetic talent show. Sophocles, Aeschylus, Euripides were the celebrity screenwriters of their day. Except, instead of red carpets, they had laurel wreaths. Slightly less glamorous, but still prestigious. Actors wore large masks, carved or molded, with exaggerated expressions. The masks helped project emotion to the back row. They also allowed one actor to play multiple roles, which meant that yes, the same man could play a grieving queen, a furious god, and a confused shepherd, all in one afternoon. Efficient, economical, emotionally flexible. And since women were not allowed to perform on the public stage in classical Athens, every female role was portrayed by a man in a mask and robes, which adds an extra layer of theatrical commitment. The chorus was a whole experience of its own. A group of men would stand together, mobe toheder, chant together, and comment on the action. Think of them as the ancient Greek comment section. They reacted to events. They asked dramatic questions. They reminded the audience of moral lessons. And occasionally, they probably wondered why they signed up for this gig in the first place. But their presence gave the play rhythm, a steady, almost hypnotic pattern of speech and movement. Now, the content of these plays was not exactly light. Greek tragedies were obsessed with fate, with prophecies, with the uncomfortable idea that no matter how hard you try to avoid disaster, you might just sprint directly into it. Oedipus hears a prophecy that he will kill his father and marry his mother. Naturally, he tries to avoid it. Naturally, he does exactly that, because of course he does. The audience already knew the myth. The suspense wasn't what will happen. It was how painfully will this unfold. And somehow, that predictability made it comforting, like a ritual. But theater wasn't only tragedy. Greek comedy had its own strange charm. Aristophanes wrote plays that poked fun at politicians, philosophers, and basically anyone with influence. His humor could be surprisingly bold. He mocked leaders during wartime. He joked about intellectual trends. He made the audience laugh at the powerful, which is always a risky hobby, but apparently Athenians appreciated the catharsis. Comedy festivals were loud, colorful, occasionally absurd. Costumes were exaggerated, plots were wild. It was less existential despair and more, what if women went on strike to end a war? Because, yes, that was a real play. Now let's gently float over to ancient Rome. The Romans loved borrowing things from Greece architecture, gods. Theater. They took Greek plays, translated them, and added their own flavor. Roman theater leaned more toward spectacle, bigger gestures, broader humor. Slapstick. Plautus and Terence wrote comedies filled with mistaken identities, clever servants, and grumpy old men. Basically, the blueprint for every sitcom ever. If you squint at it softly, Roman theaters were impressive stone structures, often freestanding rather than carved into hills. They could be massive. And the Romans, being Romans, enjoyed scale. Performances included music, dance, elaborate scenery, sometimes even water effects. Because why not flood part of the stage, if you can? Of course, actors in Rome did not enjoy the same prestige as playwrights in Greece. Acting was often considered a low-status profession. Some performers were enslaved. Applause was enthusiastic, but social respect, not so much. Fame without honor, a strangely modern dilemma. Beyond Greece and Rome, performance traditions flourished quietly across the ancient world. In India, Sanskrit drama developed with intricate gestures, music, and elaborate emotional codes, known as rasa. Each performance aimed to evoke a specific emotional flavor in the audience. Heroism, tranquility. The goal was not shock, but balance, harmony, a shared emotional journey. Meanwhile, in China, early theatrical forms blended ritual, storytelling, and music into stylized performances that would eventually influence centuries of opera traditions. Even in Mesoamerica, ritual performance and reenactment formed part of ceremonial life. Humans everywhere seem to agree on one thing. We enjoy watching other humans pretend to be slightly more dramatic versions of themselves. What makes ancient theater so strangely tender is how communal it was. There were no streaming platforms, no replay buttons. If you missed the performance, you simply missed it. The experience was shared in real time. Thousands of people breathing together, reacting together. For a few hours, their personal worries paused. Even if what they were watching involved betrayal, prophecy, and divine punishment, the structure of the play, the rhythm of the chorus, the predictability of myth created a kind of emotional container, a safe place to process big ideas slowly. And as we sit here in our imaginary stone seats, listening to the distant echo of sandals on stage, it's comforting to realize that ancient people also needed stories to make sense of chaos. They gathered, they watched, they sighed at tragic kings, who probably should have asked a few more follow-up questions before making life-altering decisions. They laughed at foolish politicians. They nodded along with moral lessons delivered in verse. Theater was not just entertainment. It was therapy, civic duty, religious ritual, and sometimes, let's be honest, an excuse to sit outside with snacks and judge fictional royalty. So tonight, as we drift further into this world of masks and marble benches, remember that the stage was humanity's mirror, slightly exaggerated, occasionally sarcastic, but always reflecting our fears, our flaws, and our tendency to dramatically overreact to prophecies. And that, honestly, hasn't changed much. All right. The torches are still flickering, the stone seats are still slightly uncomfortable, and the audience is shifting around, waiting for the next performance. So let's drift behind the stage for a moment. Not dramatically, just a soft shuffle past the painted scenery, because ancient theater may have looked grand and poetic from the front, but backstage, oh, it was human, very human. Fiaco. Let's start with the Greek actors. These men were not casual hobbyists. Acting in ancient Athens was serious business. There were only 3 principal actors allowed in a tragedy. 3. And yet a typical tragedy might have 10 or more speaking roles. So one man could play a grieving widow, then quickly switch to a furious god, and then reappear as a messenger who just ran 12 miles to announce something catastrophic, all in one show. Efficient, yes. Slightly chaotic. Es. And because there were only 3 main actors, the competition for those spots was intense. These were prestigious roles. Winning actor awards at the Dionysian festivals meant public recognition. It meant your name carried weight. It meant you might even be remembered centuries later, which, in ancient terms, was the ultimate flex. But the path there was not calm. Rivalries brewed, egos expanded. And when you're delivering monologues about fate and divine justice, it's easy to start thinking you personally have divine importance. One of the earliest famous actors we know by name was the same Thespius, whose name gives us the word thespian. According to tradition, he was the first to step out from the chorus and perform as a separate character. A bold move. Revolutionary. Probably slightly awkward at first. Imagine being the guy who decides, you know what this chanting group needs? Me. Individually. Of course he was remembered. History loves a confident pioneer. Now, Greek actors wore those iconic masks we mentioned earlier. The masks were large, dramatic, frozen in expressions of grief, rage, joy, or quiet dread. They had exaggerated features and open mouths to project sound. Some historians suggest the shape helped amplify the voice. Others debate that. But one thing is certain. The masks turned the actor into a symbol. Less Bob from Athens, more universal representation of suffering. Which is great for storytelling, slightly less great for personal branding. Because, here's the thing, with your face hidden, your individual identity fades. The character becomes bigger than you, and that required a certain kind of ego management. You had to accept that applause was for Oedipus, not necessarily for you, Demetrios, who spent 3 hours rehearsing that speech. It's humbling, or it's maddening, depending on your personality. Actors also trained intensely. Vocal projection was essential. Remember, these theaters were enormous. No microphones, no speakers. Just lungs and discipline. Gestures had to be grand enough to be seen from the back row, but controlled enough not to look ridiculous. Movement was stylized, almost dance-like. It was not naturalistic acting. It was elevated, ritualistic. Every motion deliberate, every pause measured. And let's not forget, stamina. These performances could last for hours. Entire trilogies of tragedies performed in a single day. Audiences arrived at dawn. Actors stayed on stage through emotional breakdown after emotional breakdown. If you thought modern film shoots were exhausting, try performing 3 poetic disasters back-to-back under the Mediterranean sun. Now, while actors carried the performance physically, playwrights carried it emotionally, and they were competitive. Intensely so, during major festivals, 3 tragedians would present a set of plays. Judges were chosen. A winner was declared. Imagine pouring your soul into a poetic masterpiece about divine justice, and then losing to the guy whose chorus just had better choreography. Of course, that stings. Sophocles, for example, reportedly won around 18 competitions. 18? That's not just talent. That's consistency. That's the ancient equivalent of winning Best Picture multiple times. Aeschylus before him had dominated the scene. Euripides, meanwhile, was often the edgy outsider. His plays questioned traditional values. His characters felt psychologically complex. Some Athenians found him unsettling. Others adored him. Basically, he was the art house director of classical Greece. Let's gently float over to Rome again. Roman actors had a slightly different reputation. While Greek actors could achieve a degree of respect, Roman performers often occupied a lower social status. Many were enslaved or freedmen. Acting was seen as morally questionable. The irony is delicious. Romans loved watching theater. Puckat venues, roaring laughter, standing ovations. Vat sociali. Actors were often excluded from certain civic privileges. Fame, without honor, applause without acceptance. Still, some Roman actors achieved celebrity status. One famous performer, Roscius, was so admired that his name became synonymous with acting excellence. He was reportedly a friend of Cicero. That's quite a networking achievement, to move from low-status profession to dining with elite intellectuals. Impressive. Though one suspects, there were still whispers behind his back. Society can be supportive and judgmental at the same time. Humans are wonderfully consistent like that. Roman performances also leaned into spectacle. Mime and pantomime became wildly popular. These were physical, expressive forms of storytelling. Pantomime actors could portray entire narratives alone, shifting characters through movement and gesture. It required intense physical control, and audiences adored it, which meant competition remained fierce. Rival troupes competed for favor. Managers worried about attendance, because even in ancient times, ticket sales mattered. And yes, audiences could be brutal. If a performance disappointed, boos were not unheard of. Objects might be thrown. Probably not entire amphorae of wine. That would be wasteful. But fruit, perhaps. The crowd's mood mattered. Public opinion always does. So, actors balanced artistic ambition with crowd-pleasing instincts. Too experimental? Risky? Too predictable? Boring. It's a delicate dance that performers still navigate today. What's fascinating is how personal these artistic rivalries could become. Playwrights critiqued one another. Comedies mocked competitors by name. Subtle? Not really. Aristophanes openly parodied Euripides in his plays. Imagine writing a heartfelt tragedy and then seeing yourself caricatured on stage a year later. That's one way to process creative tension, through satire, publicly, in front of thousands. And yet, beneath the ego and competition, there was devotion. Devotion to craft, to storytelling, to shared ritual. Actors rehearsed tirelessly. Playwrights revised lines. Choruses practiced synchronized movement until it felt like breathing. The effort was collective. Theater required cooperation on a grand scale. Even rivalries existed within a shared cultural love for performance. So, as we sit quietly backstage, listening to the soft murmur of performers preparing for the next act, it's comforting to realize that ancient theater wasn't some distant, marble-frozen institution. It was alive, messy, full of ambition, full of insecurity, full of people hoping the audience would clap just a little longer than they did for the last guy. In the next part, we'll ease into the lives of the audiences themselves. The citizens who filled those seats, the snacks they brought, the social dynamics of who sat where. Because ancient theater was not just about what happened on stage, it was about who was watching, and why. Why?